The wilderness stretched out as far as the eye could see, barren and harsh, its rocky terrain a constant reminder of the trials the Israelites faced on their journey to the Promised Land. Life was arduous. The people lived in temporary tents, tightly clustered by tribes, their arrangement dictated by divine instruction. At the center stood the tabernacle, the sacred dwelling place of God, a portable sanctuary that symbolized his covenant with Israel. A pillar of cloud rose from it by day, and a pillar of fire by night, guiding the people and assuring them of God's presence. This was a society born from deliverance and bound by divine law. The Israelites had been slaves in Egypt for generations, a people molded by the harshness of oppression and the miracles of liberation. Their customs were rooted in their covenant with God, expressed through rituals, sacrifices, and strict adherence to the laws handed down by Moses at Mount Sinai. The Levites, one of the 12 tribes, held a privileged yet demanding role. They were guardians of the tabernacle, serving as intermediaries between God and the people. Korah, a Levite from the family of Kohath, was a man of notable presence. Tall and commanding, his voice carried a natural authority that drew people to him. His clan, the Kohathites, had the sacred duty of transporting the holiest objects of the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, the golden lampstand, and the altars. However, their tasks came with severe restrictions. They could not touch or even look directly at these sacred items. Only Aaron and his sons, the priests, were allowed to handle them. Though Korah's role was significant, it was not enough for him. He was ambitious, his heart stirred by envy and pride. "Are we not all holy?" he often murmured to those around him. "Has the Lord not set apart this entire nation as his own? Why then should Moses and Aaron hold themselves above the rest of us?" These questions resonated with others, especially those who felt their own contributions were undervalued. Among Korah's closest allies were Dathan and Abiram, leaders from the tribe of Reuben. The Reubenites were descendants of Jacob's firstborn son, Reuben, but they had lost their preeminence over the generations. Their tribe was situated on the outskirts of the camp, far from the central tabernacle, which they interpreted as a slight against their heritage. Dathan, known for his fiery temper, and Abiram, calculating and persuasive, saw Korah's discontent as an opportunity to restore their tribe's honor. Life in the camp revolved around survival and worship. The people woke each morning to gather manna, the mysterious bread from heaven that sustained them. They prepared simple meals, told stories of their ancestors, and observed the Sabbath with solemnity. Festivals punctuated the harsh monotony, moments when the entire community came together to celebrate their deliverance and reaffirm their covenant with God. Yet, amidst these rhythms of life, tension simmered. Korah's rebellion began quietly. He approached influential leaders, men of renown, respected for their wisdom and status, and shared his grievances. "Moses has led us into a wilderness with no end in sight," he argued. "We were promised a land flowing with milk and honey, yet we wander aimlessly. Does this sound like the plan of a just leader?" His words struck a chord. Many were frustrated with the endless wandering, their faith tested by the hardships of the desert. Over time, Korah's following grew. 250 leaders joined his cause, their ranks composed of elders, warriors, and heads of families. Together, they represented a significant portion of Israel's leadership, a coalition strong enough to challenge Moses and Aaron directly. Unrest spread through the camp like wildfire. People whispered in hushed tones, casting suspicious glances at the central tent where Moses and Aaron met with God. The authority of these two brothers, once unquestioned, now seemed fragile. Korah, Dathan, and Abiram prepared to confront them, confident that their cause was just. The rebellion was no longer a matter of personal grievance, it had become a movement, a challenge to the very structure God had established. As the sun set on the camp, the air was thick with tension. The confrontation was inevitable, and the fate of the nation hung in the balance. The dawn broke over the wilderness, casting long shadows across the Israelite camp. Tension filled the air as murmurs spread among the tribes. Everyone knew something significant was brewing. Korah, now emboldened by the support of 250 influential leaders, was ready to take his challenge public. His coalition was diverse, a mix of Levites frustrated with their limited roles and tribal leaders who felt alienated by Moses' decisions. For the first time since leaving Egypt, the authority of Moses and Aaron faced a direct and organized threat. Korah's plan was as calculated as it was bold. He and his followers marched through the camp, their numbers attracting attention. Families paused their morning routines, children peeked out from their tents, and elders looked on with concern. The camp was a tightly knit society, and the sight of so many respected leaders moving together toward the tabernacle stirred anxiety. "What is happening?" people whispered, their voices filled with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The tabernacle stood at the center of the camp, a sacred space surrounded by an open courtyard. This was where the congregation gathered for worship and where Moses and Aaron often addressed the people. Today, however, the atmosphere was different. The rebels approached in a unified front, their expressions resolute. Behind them trailed a growing crowd of onlookers, drawn by the spectacle and the promise of confrontation. Korah stepped forward, his voice ringing out with clarity and confidence. "You have gone too far, Moses and Aaron," he declared, pointing an accusatory finger. "The whole community is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you set yourselves above the Lord's assembly?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. Korah's words were not just a criticism, they were a direct challenge to the divine order. To many, his argument seemed reasonable. After all, had not God declared Israel a holy nation? Why should two men hold such exclusive power? Moses stood silent for a moment, his face reflecting both grief and determination. Then, in an act of profound humility, he fell face down to the ground. It was not an act of submission to Korah, but one of prayer and intercession. The people watched in stunned silence as Moses sought guidance from God. When he finally rose, his voice was steady but filled with sorrow. "Tomorrow morning," Moses said, addressing Korah and his followers, "the Lord will show who belongs to him and who is holy, and he will have that person come near him. You, Korah, and all your followers are to appear before the Lord. Each of you is to take a censer and put incense in it, and present it before the Lord. Aaron will do the same." Korah's face remained impassive, but inside, he was emboldened. To him, this was not a test of divine authority but an opportunity to demonstrate the strength of his cause. The rebels dispersed to prepare, their confidence growing with every step. As the crowd began to dissipate, two figures remained rooted in place, Dathan and Abiram. Unlike Korah, their grievances were not about priestly duties but about leadership itself. They refused even to approach Moses when he summoned them. "We will not come," they declared defiantly. "Isn't it enough that you have brought us up out of a land flowing with milk and honey to kill us in the wilderness? And now you also want to lord it over us? No, we will not come." Their words were laced with bitter irony. The land flowing with milk and honey they referred to as Egypt, a land where they had lived as slaves. Yet their disillusionment with Moses' leadership had twisted their memories. To them, the wilderness journey was not liberation but a path to suffering and death. Moses' heart grew heavier. He knew their rebellion was not just against him but against God's plan. Raising his voice to heaven, he prayed, "Do not accept their offering. I have not taken so much as a donkey from them, nor have I wronged any of them." His plea was a desperate cry for justice, not for his own sake but for the sanctity of God's covenant. That evening, the camp was quiet, but the tension was palpable. Families gathered around their fires, speaking in hushed tones about what the next day might bring. Some expressed fear, others doubt, and a few whispered words of support for Korah. After all, he had given voice to frustrations many shared. Yet there was an unease in the air, a sense that the confrontation would bring more than just words, it would bring judgment. The stage was set for the ultimate test of authority and faith. Tomorrow, in the presence of the entire congregation, the rebels would stand before God, incense in hand, to prove their cause. What they could not see, what no one could yet fathom, was how swiftly and decisively God would answer their challenge. The morning sun rose over the camp, casting a golden hue on the thousands of tents that stretched across the barren wilderness. But the usual rhythms of the day were absent. No one went to gather manna or prepare morning meals. Instead, all eyes turned toward the tabernacle at the center of the camp. Today was no ordinary day. Today, God himself would decide who truly held authority over his people. Korah and his followers assembled with their censers in hand. These ornate vessels, normally reserved for offerings of incense, gleamed in the morning light. Their confidence was palpable, their expressions defiant. To them, this was a moment of reckoning, not just for Moses and Aaron, but for the entire structure of Israel's leadership. The crowd gathered slowly, murmurs rippling through the assembly. Families brought their children, elders leaned on their staffs, and even those who had stayed neutral in the conflict felt compelled to witness what would unfold. The tension in the air was thick, almost tangible. Moses stood silently at the entrance of the tabernacle, his face heavy with sorrow but resolute. Beside him was Aaron, clutching his own censer with an expression of calm born from faith. Moses raised his hand, signaling the beginning of the ritual. "You, Korah, and all your followers," he called out, his voice steady and commanding, "take your censers, and place incense in them before the Lord. Let him decide who is holy and who he has chosen." The rebels moved forward, their movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. Each man lit his censer, the fragrant smoke rising in delicate spirals toward the heavens. The crowd watched in rapt silence, the only sound the crackling of fire and the faint whispers of prayer from onlookers. But not everyone was present. Dathan and Abiram had refused to come, remaining defiantly in their tents. Moses, however, was undeterred. Turning to the congregation, he spoke with a voice filled with divine authority. "Move away from the tents of these wicked men," he commanded, gesturing toward the encampments of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. "Do not touch anything that belongs to them, or you will be swept away because of their sins." The crowd hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity. Slowly, families began to back away, distancing themselves from the rebels' dwellings. Mothers clutched their children tightly, while men exchanged uneasy glances. The sight of Moses standing alone, unwavering, only deepened their apprehension. Dathan and Abiram emerged from their tents, their faces etched with disdain. They stood proudly with their families at their sides, their defiance unshaken. "See?" Dathan sneered to those nearby. "Moses would destroy us for daring to question him. He has made himself a tyrant over God's people." Moses turned his gaze heavenward and prayed aloud, his voice trembling with both conviction and sorrow. "If these men die a natural death, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the ground opens its mouth and swallows them alive, then you will know that these men have treated the Lord with contempt." A sudden stillness fell over the camp. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, without warning, the earth beneath Dathan, Abiram, and their families began to tremble. Gasps erupted from the crowd as the ground split apart, a deep fissure forming beneath their feet. Cries of terror filled the air as the rebels and everything they owned were swallowed by the yawning chasm. Their screams echoed briefly before being silenced as the earth closed over them. The camp erupted in chaos as people scrambled to distance themselves from the scene, some falling to their knees in horror, others wailing in fear. And yet, it was not over. Even as the dust settled, fire burst forth from the tabernacle, consuming the 250 men who had dared to offer incense in defiance of God's chosen order. The flames roared with a ferocity that left no doubt of their divine origin. When the fire subsided, nothing remained of the rebels but the smoldering censers they had held so confidently. The congregation was paralyzed, staring at the devastation before them. The once proud leaders were gone, their rebellion reduced to ash and silence. Slowly, the people began to grasp the enormity of what they had witnessed. This was no mere punishment, it was a declaration from God himself, a reaffirmation of his sovereignty and his choice of Moses and Aaron. As the crowd dispersed, their faces etched with shock and awe, Moses turned to Aaron. "Gather the censers from the ashes," he said. "Let them be hammered into sheets to overlay the altar, as a reminder to the people that no one except the descendants of Aaron may burn incense before the Lord. Let this serve as a sign to Israel for all generations." Aaron nodded, his expression solemn. Together, they began the task of reclaiming the remnants of the rebellion, ensuring that its memory would endure as a warning to all who might challenge God's authority. The camp was eerily silent in the hours following the divine judgment. The ground, now closed over the rebellious households of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, bore no sign of the cataclysmic event that had just unfolded. Only the lingering smell of smoke and the scorched remains of the censers reminded the people of the fire that had consumed the 250 men. Shock had gripped the nation. Families gathered in tight clusters, speaking in hushed tones, their faces pale with fear. Some wept openly, mourning the loss of those they had respected and followed. Others knelt in prayer, their hearts filled with a renewed reverence for the God who had spoken so decisively. Moses and Aaron, standing near the remains of the censers, were somber but resolute. The judgment was not one they had sought, but it had been necessary to restore order and confirm God's authority. At Moses' instruction, the remaining priests began gathering the scorched censers. These once proud symbols of rebellion would now serve as a lasting reminder to the nation. "These are holy," Moses declared to the priests. "Hammer them into plates to overlay the altar. Let them be a sign to Israel, so that no one, except a descendant of Aaron, should presume to come near the Lord to burn incense. Let this be a warning for generations to come." The people watched as the priests worked, their movements deliberate and reverent. The metallic clang of hammer on bronze echoed through the camp, a sound that seemed to drive home the gravity of the day's events. Every strike was a reminder of the cost of rebellion and the sanctity of God's appointed order. But even amid the sobering realization, not everyone's heart was changed. By the following morning, grumblings began anew among the people. "You have killed the Lord's people," they accused Moses and Aaron, their anger fueled by grief and fear. The human tendency to deflect blame reared its head, even in the face of such undeniable evidence of God's hand. As the murmurs grew louder, the cloud of God's presence descended over the tabernacle once more. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, warning them of the people's persistent rebellion. "Move away from this assembly," he said, "so I can put an end to them at once." But Moses and Aaron, instead of seeking vindication, fell face down again in intercession. "God, you who bring life to all, will you be angry with the entire assembly when only one man sinned?" Moses pleaded. Once more, their hearts revealed their true nature, not as tyrants, as they had been accused, but as shepherds of a wayward flock. In response to their prayers, Moses instructed Aaron to take his censer, fill it with incense, and make atonement for the people. Aaron ran into the midst of the assembly, standing between the living and the dead as a plague began to sweep through the camp. His actions halted the plague, but not before 14,700 lives were lost. As the day ended, the camp was subdued, its people bowed by the weight of their collective disobedience. The events of the past 2 days had left an indelible mark on the nation. The memory of Korah's rebellion, and the mercy extended even in judgment, would not soon be forgotten. In the days that followed, the camp remained solemn. The people carried a heavy sense of awe and fear, their hearts weighed by the events they had witnessed. The rebellion of Korah and his followers had brought devastating consequences, but it also left a lasting lesson: God's authority was not to be questioned, and his chosen leaders were to be respected. Yet, God, in his mercy, sought to reaffirm his covenant with Israel and establish peace among the tribes. To settle any lingering doubts about his selection of Aaron as the high priest, the Lord instructed Moses to gather a staff from the leader of each tribe. These 12 staffs, each bearing the name of its tribal leader, were to be placed in the tabernacle overnight. "The staff belonging to the man I choose will sprout," God declared. "This will put an end to their grumbling against me." The leaders of the tribes obeyed, and Moses brought their staffs before the Lord, placing them in the tent of meeting. Among them was Aaron's staff, a simple piece of wood, worn and weathered from years of use. The people waited anxiously, their eyes fixed on the tabernacle, knowing this was another moment when God would reveal his will. The following morning, Moses entered the tent of meeting and emerged holding the 12 staffs. The crowd pressed closer, straining to see. As he held them high, gasps rippled through the assembly. Aaron's staff had not only sprouted, it had budded, blossomed, and produced ripe almonds. It was a miraculous sign, undeniable in its meaning. God had chosen Aaron and his descendants to serve as priests, and his decision was irrevocable. The people bowed their heads in reverence, their doubts silenced by the sight of the living staff. At God's command, the staff of Aaron was placed in the Ark of the Covenant as a perpetual reminder of his authority and the sanctity of the priesthood. From that day forward, no one dared to question the role of Aaron or his sons. Life in the camp slowly returned to its rhythms. The people continued their journey through the wilderness, carrying with them the memory of Korah's rebellion and the lessons it imparted. The bronze plates from the censers adorned the altar, a visible warning against pride and disobedience. The blossoming staff of Aaron, tucked safely within the ark, reminded them of God's mercy and faithfulness. For Moses and Aaron, the events left scars, both emotional and spiritual. Leading a people prone to rebellion was a burden they bore with humility and a reliance on God's strength. Yet, they knew their mission was far from over. The promised land still lay ahead, and with it, the fulfillment of God's covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. As the Israelites journeyed onward, the rebellion of Korah became more than a cautionary tale. It was a testament to the unshakable authority of God and the enduring call to obedience and humility. Though the wilderness was harsh, the people of Israel were reminded that they were not abandoned. Their God was with them, a God of justice, mercy, and relentless faithfulness.